So, very much welcome to this table talk that we will have now for 45 minutes, 1 hour, around there. And it's not much to table, but it is a table though. And it doesn't look like the tables in Gutenberg, but it's a table, and it is a table talk. And the people which I will talk with in this table talk, yes, you can introduce yourself. Medeleine, you can begin.
I am Sister Medeleine Fredell, Dominican sister from the Catholic Church. I'm a theologian, and I'm working on a daily basis with political issues for the Catholic diocese here. It's called Justice and Peace Commission. And I'm also working with equality issues. My background is from the beginning. I was a trilingual correspondence secretary. Then I switched to classical languages and French and became a teacher. And then I switched to Hebrew and Greek. And I have an exam from the Institut Catholique de Paris in exegesis and these languages. And then later on, I continued to work with feminist theology and Catholic social thought. And when I had a time finally, at the beginning of first 10 years, 2000, I took a master in contemporary theology at Heathrow College, London University. I've been working on an international basis for my Dominican order, for my congregation as sister, but also for the brothers, mostly with justice and peace issues, but also structural issues in the church. So,
Thank you. And Otfried?
Yes, my name is Otfried Czaika. I'm originally from Germany, where I started in the 1990s studying theology at the University of Munich. In the late 90s, I started a long peregrinatio academica through Scandinavia, and it's not even the end of these 20 years of academic peregrination. I did my PhD in Helsinki in church history on a topic on Swedish Reformation and the context to Germany. After that, I served as a teacher at Linköping's University, later as a researcher at the Royal Library in Stockholm. And since 2013, I'm professor of church history specialized on the Reformation at MF Norwegian School of Theology in Oslo, but I live just a few meters here from the Cathedral of Karlstads.
Thank you. Graham, you have written the book actually that's called Luther och hans värld in Swedish.
That's right. My name is Graham Tomlin, and I should say thank you very much that this is happening in English. I think that's my fault. At least it's all for my benefit, so I'm very grateful to you, because I don't speak any Swedish at all. But I'm delighted to be here. It's my very first visit to Sweden, so I'm very pleased to be here. I was ordained in the Church of England back in 1986, and so spent most of my ministry in academic life. I was in Oxford within the university there for 16 years, teaching a number of different subjects, mainly historical theology. I'd done my doctorate on St. Paul, Luther and Pascal, Blaise Pascal, on the theology of the cross, and continued to teach on the Reformation and on Martin Luther within the University of Oxford for many years. I then moved to London about 12 years ago now to help to set up a new type of theological college in London, which was called St. Mellitus College, which was a partnership between the Diocese of London and the Diocese of Chelmsford, where you have a very strong link with the diocese here as well. So I was the principal of that college for about 10 years. And then 2 years ago, I became the Bishop of Kensington, which is part of the Diocese of London in the Church of England. So I am now the Bishop of Kensington. I still keep a role within St. Mellitus College, doing little bits of teaching, keep writing when I can, and otherwise I share in episcopal duties with other bishops within the Diocese of London.
And nice to have you here on this table talk, all three of you. And Graham, we begin with a question to you. What do you think Luther has to say to people today?
It's a question I think we've been asking ourselves during this Great Reformation year. What is the relevance of what Luther had to say 500 years ago to people today? And as I've thought about it, I often think of something Luther would often say or write, which is that we are justified by the merits of another. Another thing he would often say was that he would talk about an external righteousness as opposed to an internal righteousness. And I think in the context of the 16th century, what was quite unique about Luther was that he changed the grounds upon which justification took place. In late medieval theology and spirituality, the idea was that, of course, nobody believed in justification by works alone, as if you could work your way to God on your own. Most people believed in some kind of cooperation between divine grace and human activity. But the way this worked was that if you turned towards God, God would give you grace to enable you to perform works that were genuinely meritorious. And there was this idea of merit, whereby we were able to perform works with the help of grace that led to an internal process of transformation, which of course was never complete by the end of this life, would continue within purgatory beyond. And I think Luther struggled with this idea of what he called an internal righteousness, that justification could only be pronounced at the end of a long process of internal change, of genuine internal transformation. And that's what I think he meant by an internal righteousness. And I think Luther's great insight was to say, well, no, we are not justified on the basis of our own righteousness, however much helped by the divine grace. No, instead we are justified on the merits of Christ. It is not our own internal righteousness that justifies us, it's the righteousness, the goodness of Christ that justifies us. So that shift on the grounds of justification, that we are justified, we are made right with God, not by our own merits, not by an internal process of change or growth in holiness, but instead upon the merits of Christ, an external righteousness. That, I think, was at the heart of his insight. And I think that says something quite significant to our age as well, because when I think of people, certainly in London, I don't know whether it's true here in Sweden as well, but we are a culture which is very self-obsessed, self-focused, where it is all about self-realization, self-discovery, self-establishment. We have to establish ourselves. We have to pass the judgment, not the judgment of God, but the judgment of Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and everything else. And that is a very exhausting process, to try to justify yourself before other people. And we have to justify it by an internal righteousness, by proving ourselves, by our achievement, by our looks, by our things that we generate from within ourselves. And there's something that's very good news, very gospel, about being told actually we are not justified by how successful we are, by our own achievements. We are not defined by our achievements or by our mistakes. And we are defined instead by who we are in Christ, something external to ourselves. And I think that is something quite powerful. It speaks to our world. It speaks to me that my identity is found not within myself, but outside myself. My identity is found in Christ. That is something secure, something I can rely upon, something that cannot change. Whereas I know my own internal feelings, my own internal goodness fluctuates from day to day. So I think that is one of the things that Luther says to our world today.
It's kind of an existential level that actually connects us 500 years back.
Exactly, that's right, yeah.
Yes.
Something that speaks quite powerfully at the same time.
Otfried or Medeleine?
Yes, I would underline what you are saying. In the end, it's a question of anthropology or existential question, which Luther would answer even nowadays. So it's the question, how would you become a free human being in the end, without all those external worldly boundaries like Facebook, Twitter and Instagram? And I'm very glad that you, Graham, have answered the question like that, because quite often we might hear people instrumentalizing Martin Luther, the 16th century and Reformation, and saying, if Luther would have lived today, he would have answered this practical theological question like that, or in this way. And I think we really have to remind that Luther is there 500 years ago in a totally different world, living without Twitter, Facebook, without cars, without global warming, without every question we might deal today. So we cannot use or misuse Martin Luther or the Reformation or someone else who lived in history and instrumentalize their ideas and what they have said or written for our religious, theological problems, or the problems we might have in a single church. And that is even done. So please, if you hear someone doing like that, so same to shut up. That's not the right way of using history, because Luther is just there. He is not answering a single question. He's answering those questions concerning anthropology or what the existence of a human being is in the end.
Madeleine?
It's interesting with this anthropological point of view, because the present Pope, Francis, he is calling for a new theological anthropology. And I personally think, and he's doing this in relation to ecology, of course, to these questions. But I think that that will introduce maybe a new reform in the church, because if we start thinking about a new anthropology, we will automatically think of a new Christology and then a new ecclesiology. And maybe, as we are always today, hopefully, focused on unity, this could finally lead us to a visible unity between the churches. And when I say that, I don't mean necessarily a structural unity. We can maybe come back to that, because there are two differences there. But I think that we are craving today, or people are craving today, for meaning in life. And so a reform in our churches should be, how do we give the tools to people to create meaning in life? Because we cannot provide meaning in life, you have to create it yourself, but we have to provide the tools for it. And another thing, which goes into my political work a bit, it's mercy and love. And I heard an economist talking about love in economy. And for me it was rather surprising, because it was a word I had never heard in economical thought and discourse. But obviously today we need to see economy from another point of view. And then that is a question which is cast back to our churches. How do we put the human being in the center of economy? And there I think that this will be the starting point of a new reform also for our churches. We can come back to it.
And I would like to turn to the question about the Reformation in Sweden, because the Reformation was very different in different countries. And Otfried, what would you say was typical for the Reformation in Sweden?
Oh, I think I could speak about that many hours on the end. I will try to make it short, quite short. Firstly, I think even here we have to be extremely cautious, because there are so many mythologizations, ideas of how we imagine the Reformation in Sweden, or the Reformation in general. And quite often we came across this view of the dark Middle Ages and the light of the Reformation. This is a quite easy concept, which is even turned on its head often, as the Middle Ages are presented as the age of the light, where we have this clear and nice and good devotional life, and then comes the bad monk from Wittenberg and destroys everything. So we find quite often when we read something about the Reformation, those different values, the good or the bad Reformation, or the good or the bad Middle Ages. And I think this is totally anachronistic, thinking in the way that with 1517 something radical really changes. Middle Ages aren't ended by 1517. Martin Luther is a monk. He lives in a monastery. His thinking comes from the Middle Ages. But reform wasn't absent during the Middle Ages. It was not the first schism we find in the history of Christianity, which is the Reformation in Wittenberg. We have to remind that there are at least two other churches existing, which are Reformed churches in the Middle Ages, which are the Waldensians and the Hussites in the end. So it's not the first time we might find a Reformation with that what happens here. So we have to get rid of all those images and values we might have as a layer up on the Reformation. And it's extremely often used for the Reformation in Sweden that here it comes some kind of external German non-Swedish import, which is totally odd and does not belong to Sweden. Here we have a misunderstanding that Sweden should have existed as a nation in the 15th or 16th century. Sweden wasn't the Sweden it was today. And then that even there are all those German burghers in Stockholm promoting and just importing those things and making some kind of rape of the well-functioning Catholic Church in Sweden. So it wasn't so easy, because the Church in Sweden at the eve of the Reformation had quite the similar problems as other churches had in Central Europe. We might often read that indulgences were not a problem in the Church of Sweden at the eve of Reformation. This is not true. We find records at the Fuggers in Augsburg that 10,000 of dollars went from Sweden to the Pope in Rome. So there were many indulgences sold in the 1480s, 1419, in the 1510s. So we should on the one hand see that quite many things might be very similar. We have as well a strong humanistic movement in Sweden, which makes the ground for the Reformation here in Sweden. But then we might come to this, what is really special, because there is something which might be true, this thing of import. Sweden and Scandinavia has always lived as some kind as an importing nation. Nothing was invented here. Not Christianity, not the Catholic Church, not the Reformation. Everything was imported. And thus even the Reformation comes in some extent as a second-hand Reformation. Martin Luther is not acting in Uppsala, he's acting in Wittenberg. And we have no Zwingli here. So Reformation comes through the students in Wittenberg or in other places in Central Europe, and they might have already seen that what is useful and what is not useful for Sweden. So they can deal in a totally different manner as theologians in Germany. So there are not all those quarrels on this kind of how to deal with Lord's Supper or with synergy or with other systematic issues. What is quite typical for Reformation, not only in Sweden but in entire Scandinavia, that it's a quite practical Reformation. We have not a functioning university. Uppsala is closed until 1593, since 1515 in the end, so there's no one discussing theology at the level of the universities. That means that the bishops, that the priests can make their own practical Reformation, and what we see happens is that Olaus Petri in Stockholm or Mikael Agricola in Turku or in Åbo in Finland, they just take texts from other places and they use what they want. What is useful in their religious this in the context of the Swedish or Finnish society of the 16th century and make it function. So I would say the Swedish Reformation is a practical Reformation, not dealing so much with the big issues of systematic theology. But even here we have to be cautious, because quite often we understand Martin Luther as a systematic theologian. Martin Luther wasn't a systematic theologian either. He was reacting and acting practical as well. But he wrote much more than the Scandinavian reformers, and he was thinking on a higher level, might be, and not only at the practical level.
Madeleine, one of Pope Francis' favorite expression is Ecclesia semper reformanda est, and translated to English, that's reform is part of being a church. Reform is part of being a church. And what needs reform in our churches today, you think?
Well, I mentioned a bit about it, and I think that, I don't know if you are coming back to Pope Francis, because he had a reform program which is rather special.
Please tell us.
Do you want me to take that?
Please tell us.
Okay. And I think it's becoming more and more interesting. First of all, it's not about a reform, because he's just trying to implement the Second Vatican Council, which took place between 1962 and 65. And everything was developed after that, but at one point, and we can say, politically speaking, it was around 89, and the fall of communism. And then the Pope, then John Paul II, he became very powerful. He forgot about the Second Vatican Council in some way, and everything turned a bit backwards in the Catholic Church. So one thing is, he's trying to pick up what the document said from the Vatican Council and trying to implement it again. Now, one of those things is subsidiarity, and that is very difficult. We always tend to put responsibility higher up. We want the Pope, as a Catholic, he should take responsibility. If it goes wrong, we can always blame him. It's not our fault. What he is actually doing is to ask the bishops' conferences, the local bishops' conferences, and even the dioceses to take responsibility. And we have it recently in a very interesting matter, and that is on family issues. We had a synod of bishops in Rome, and on family issues, and it was very full of discussions and problems. Outcome, a document, Amoris Laetitia, the joy of love. And there the Pope asks local churches to make implementations which are in accord with the culture. Like for divorces and things like that. You take responsibility for this. Try to change it where you are. That has created havoc. Because many conservatives, they felt uneasy, and they want to put the responsibility on the Pope. And why isn't he following the traditional teaching? Well, no, it doesn't function in our different cultural contexts. So he tries to put it down on the local level again. We can see it in liturgy. That's another contentious issue in the Catholic Church. And he says, no, all the translations should be decided by the local churches. You know your own language. You know what it will be best. And this had created a problem during Benedict XVI, especially for Sweden. We had made a new translation, and it was sent to and from to Rome, and it was corrected all the time. Finally, as they couldn't reach a solution, Benedict went into the translation, and it became a disaster. He didn't know Swedish. He thought he knew, but he didn't. Now the Pope says, you take responsibility for this. Oh, then we will have the war going on among ourselves, and the poor bishop has to be the responsible person. But it's much better anyway. Now, he is doing this on question after question. And he is then creating enemies. And especially around him in the Curia, because they thought they had the power. And now all of a sudden they should become service agencies to the local churches and not the other way around. But one thing, if you are introducing such a revolution in the church, because it is more or less a revolution, at least a reform, then you have to act very quickly. If you don't, you create even more enemies. And that has happened. If you remember, he gave a talk to the Curia in December 2014. The Curia is his closest collaborators. And he said that they were suffering from spiritual Alzheimer. They saw themselves as indispensable. They were driven by jealousy, vanity, gossips, and were indifferent to people's ordinary situation, ordinary life. And he said that they were sterile pessimists. Now, if you say that as the highest leader to your closest collaborators, what will happen? They won't like you, that's one for certain. But you have to make changes immediately. The following day you have to change. Otherwise, you will have war, or you will have very strong enemies. And that is exactly what has happened. Now he's asking them, local churches, to take responsibility, and many are opposing that. We don't want that. But this is exactly what has to happen. Because if we are now jumping, if we are a common priesthood, we are all priests, as you said so beautifully this morning. Then, and this is a phrase from the Second Vatican Council, very much underlined, then we have to take responsibility. And that is the reform, I would say today. And that would be the reform for all churches. Okay, I leave it there, but we can come back to it.
Yes. It's about responsibility. That's an interesting point. Graham, we have a Luther commemoration, not only in Sweden, but in Germany and everywhere in Northern Europe and elsewhere also. What would you say is the significance of this Luther commemoration, 2017, if we compare it to others in the past?
Well, of course, this is not the first Luther commemoration there's been. There have been many more before this, and I've been doing a little bit of reading recently on the commemoration in 1883, which was the 400th anniversary of Luther's birth, and that was a very significant event in German history. And at the time, Germany was being kind of reformed, and it was a kind of new resurgent Catholicism at the time, and the anniversary of Luther's birth was taken as an opportunity to reassert the anti-Catholic Luther, and this was very much Luther, the opponent of the Pope, the Catholic Church, very much the Protestant Luther, and he was also portrayed as the precursor of the modern world, as if, as you were saying, the Middle Ages was the darkened past. Luther was the beginning of the light of a new world that led into the Enlightenment and the kind of modern world. And Luther was rather divorced from his medieval background and seen as a precursor to everything that was good and modern in the world. So The rise of individualism, that was all down to Luther. The rise of capitalism, that was all down to Luther. You know, everything that they wanted to say was good about the modern world was down to Luther. And of course that was a time also when it was a very significant time for Luther's studies. The great Weimar edition of Luther's works, which is of course the edition that you kind of refer to, which is the classic edition of Luther's works in the original languages of Latin and German, was started in 1883. It runs to hundreds of volumes now. And again, if you go to German cities, I don't know whether you have them in Sweden, but German cities now, in Worms, in Eisleben, in Eisenach, in Wittenberg, you have these great statues of Luther. And he always has a particular pose in these statues. He's always standing like this. He always has a Bible in one hand and maybe a copy of the 95 Theses in the other. He's standing in this very heroic pose, and it's a very, very distinct image of Luther, the hero, the German hero, the Protestant hero, over against the Catholics, the originator of the modern world. And it struck me that this commemoration is very different from that. In between, we've gone through quite a lot of change in our understanding of Luther. There's been a kind of rediscovery of Luther's medieval roots, and the sense in which Luther was very much continuous with the Middle Ages, not a complete break from the Middle Ages. There's been a rediscovery of, in many ways, the Catholic Luther, the very sacramental Luther, the Luther for whom God's word comes to us not just in verbal form, but in the bread and wine of the Lord's Supper, in whom Christ incarnate is given to us in the water of baptism, and so on. So it struck me this time, this commemoration, has in a sense rediscovered Luther as someone who belongs to the whole church, not just to the Protestants. I was in Westminster Abbey in London a couple of weeks ago on the 31st of October, and it was a commemoration of the Reformation. It was the main event in England, and the Archbishop of Canterbury was there with the Catholic Cardinal, the representatives of the Lutheran Church in Britain. And it was a very significant event because, of course, back in 1999, the joint declaration on justification had been made between the Catholic Church and the Lutherans. Last year, we Anglicans also signalled we signed up to that as well. A presentation was made by the Archbishop to the Catholic Cardinal and to the Lutheran, the head of the Lutheran Church in Britain, giving a certificate of this event. And so it very much made the point that Luther is, you cannot simply assign him to the modern day or the past. He is very much a person of his age. And yet he speaks in kind of significant ways to our current day, but also who is someone who belongs to the whole church and speaks to the whole church. And I think that's a very positive thing we can say about Luther today. There's been this reclaiming of Luther. Because in that service, the Orthodox were there, the Catholics were there, the Lutherans were there, the Anglicans were there, the Free Church were there, all in some way acknowledging Luther as someone who brings something unique and special to the church. And I think just to conclude what I wanted to say, if there's something that Luther does bring to the whole church, it is, I think, this insight that at the heart of our relationship to God, our Creator, is this central aspect of trust. I often think that the justification by faith, justitia fide, would better be translated in English, not so much justification by faith, but justification by trust. That at the heart, if you think of the heart of our human relationships, the most important thing is trust. If you have trust in a human relationship, you can do almost anything. At the heart of any marriage, any family, any community, trust is absolutely central. And I think that was in some ways Luther's great insight into the heart of our relationship, not just with each other, but our relationship with God. That if trust is there, anything is possible. Without trust, almost nothing is possible. And so I think that's something which, if you like, the whole church has now acknowledged. It was fascinating to see the Catholic Cardinal getting up in the Westminster Abbey, starting with the words, "Justification by faith is the heart of the gospel and should be preached by every part of the church." And so it struck me as this very strong ecumenical note to the Reformation commemoration this year, which I welcome a great deal.
Thank you.
Yes, I think it's much more ecumenical and it's much more international, even in terms of which researchers are dealing with Reformation nowadays. And I think we have to, you named 1883 in Germany. We should even here in Sweden remember that we have another Jubilee in 1893. It's the 300 years commemoration of the Uppsala Möte, or the Diet of Uppsala, where the first Swedish confession is written, the first Lutheran confession. And then we have 1917, and here starts everything with the so-called Luther Renaissance, which even has its antagonists in other churches then as well. But the Luther Renaissance makes the view of Luther and Lutheran theology and Reformation during a long time of the 20th century. And here in Sweden we have to remember those guys from Lund, as Gustav Aulin, Anders Nygren, and many, many others who have written about Luther, but who are all of them quite unisonos saying that Luther is the big hero. He has solved already 1517 all our problems which we might have nowadays in the modern world.
I would like to connect to your, when you said trust as the justification of faith. And I believe that if we are to see a new reform in our churches, we have to develop what we call fides qua, the faith as such, not faith in anything, but faith, trust in life, confidence, and also which tools should we give to people to help them do this. Because if we do not have this trust to start with, I suspect that we will end up in a wrong way when we are defining the contents of our faith, which we have done during all centuries as well. But I also think, looking at Luther as such, as a person, for me as a Catholic, he is like a whistleblower. He puts his finger on what is really necessary to look at a specific moment. And we need those whistleblowers in our churches today, but we are muzzling them all the time. So, I mean, if we should be respectful to the heritage of Luther, we should also listen to whistleblowers. And that is true, I think, in all churches, in fact.
Yeah, even what you said earlier about those fights and quarrels in the Roman Church right now, I think this is not special for the Roman Church. We have had all those issues, and we have them even in the Church of Sweden and in other churches, where we have those who are working for renewal and reform, and they make enemies all over the church, in this corner and another corner. And what you named about marriage, for example, or other things, we have had all those issues even in Protestant churches, perhaps a little bit earlier sometimes, often at the same time. But what you said about the Second Vatican Council, we have to remember that it was 50 years ago. And if you go back 50 years, what was a Protestant church or the Church of Sweden looking like? What were the issues? What were the big issues and discussions then? And I think there we might find quite a lot of similarities in the end. So ending up in the 1960s and 1970s, we might find that we are in the same boat in the end, with all these discussions we have. Interestingly, even what you told about Pope Francis and this mercy and love in the beginning, there we can go back the 50 years in Protestant theology. We might find Gustav Wingren, one of the last guys of the Luther Renaissance, but totally different in some respect, who is talking about this of mercy, love. In the end, he's talking about creation. And I think that's what it is about. what churches need if they want really to have a renewal. Go back to what you named in the beginning, anthropology. What is it to be a human being? How are we created? What needs do we have, and how is our trust or faith or fides quo?
And then we're back to the question about faith and trust, because I agree with you that actually the Greek word for faith, pistis, is better translated trust, I think. And Luther is really a theologian of trust, and he is an existential theologist, I think. And I think there's no happy coincidence that Søren Kierkegaard, the famous existential philosopher, was actually a Lutheran, because, and I think Lev Chesto said that Søren Kierkegaard was the Lutheran, the philosophy of the Lutheran faith, that is existentialism. Otfried, can you tell us something about the printing press? Because that's your area now, and its meaning and impact for the Reformation.
Oh yes, we can connect that to what I have talked about a little bit earlier, that we quite often see only the Reformation as a single event, even what you named, Graham, this hero Martin Luther. He stands there on all those statues in German cities, and we think that he came and everything changed. Researchers in history and church history have pointed out, and you named that as well during the last decades in the end, is the contextualization of the Reformation and this man in Wittenberg 1570. We have to see the contact, the beginning of Martin Luther in the Middle Ages. We have to see the political questions in the German Empire during the 16th century, in entire Europe. We have to look at the global structures in that time, because we should not forget that in 1492 the New World that Columbus sailed to the New World, and so everything, a lot of things were changing, and Luther was just someone who is here in the mid of a bigger and bigger change in Europe, which might have already been there the last 50, 100 or 200 or maybe 300 years. So he might be in the middle of a development and not somewhere, the end or the beginning. And here comes even in the question of why is this everything happening, 1517, and why is Luther the Luther he is in the end? Why is his Reformation in the end more successful than the Reformation 100 years before Martin Luther of Jan Hus, for example, in Bohemia? And here I think we have to turn to that the world had changed in terms of reproduction technology for books. What we did earlier was just writing for hand, and writing 500 or 1,000 pages by hand for a monk in a monastery might take an entire year. So it takes time to copy books. But then we have this man in central Germany, 1450, 54, 55, Johannes Gutenberg, who has really a fantastic new invention. He uses in the end what is used there in central Germany for producing wine, the wine press. But he uses the wine press for printing books. And thus he might be able to print a book of 400 copies just in a month, which would earlier have been taken 400 years for one monk to produce in the end, or 400 monks for 1 year to produce 400 copies. So what is happening in Central Europe and all over Europe in the end since the 1450s is that we have a revolution of reproduction, of printing in the end, that everyone might easily get a book in his hands. And even if not everyone is able to read at the eve of Reformation, We in fact have broadcasting possibilities at the eve of Reformation, because it's sufficient if in a village or a city there is one or two people who are able to read, and that they get a book in their hands and that they might read for others. So what we really see is that the written word becomes more and more important. And there we might have sometimes a totally wrong understanding of the productivity of the printing market in the beginning of the 16th century. For example, in the German city of Augsburg, which is only one of many important printing centers in Central Europe. In Augsburg are printed during the period of 5 years about 1 million copies of different books. So here are 1 million copies of maybe 10,000 books produced only in one city. And we have Basel, we have Strasbourg, we have Leipzig, and in the end we have even Wittenberg. So entire Europe is overfloated by prints, leaving especially the German book market. And there are many prints in Latin, and they might be read by everyone. The 95 Theses of Martin Luther are not only, they are in the beginning published in Latin, then they are translated and spread through Germany, but they are not only spread in German language, but especially in Latin. After just some months, everyone in entire Europe, everyone who is able to read Latin was informed what had happened in Wittenberg at the 31st of October 1570. And here we have to remember that Martin Luther is extremely skilled in the use of the printed word. If you would like to read something really good and nice about Reformation, which you have not read before, you should read the book of my colleague Andrew Pettigrew, Brand Luther. Pettigrew shows how efficient Martin Luther has understood that he has to use the printing market. I think he has understood if he does not use the printing market, it might go the same way for him as it went for Jan Hus 102 years before. Martin Luther has understood that he needs the printing market in order to create publicity, because in the end only publicity may give him shelter from the council or the Pope or the Emperor in Germany, which might have murdered him in the same way. Jan Hus was murdered 102 years before. And thus Martin Luther uses the printing press extremely efficient. He really goes to the printers. He shows them what he has written, the first 10 pages, and then he writes further and further while they are already printing. So he really uses the market and sees that everyone might be able to get his prints in the hand. And Wittenberg, in the end, invents the modern book. That a book looks like a book as it looks today is invented in the end. In Wittenberg, that we have the author on the title page, that we might have somewhere on the title page or on the first pages even the printing place. That was not true for late medieval prints. They often start with the first words of St. Augustine or something like that, the incipit. And then we might find in small letters on the last page that it was someone in Venice or in Strasbourg who printed the book. No, this is a selling argument having Martin Luther and Wittenberg on the title page. So the modern book is in fact invented in Wittenberg. And that's not me who have found that, it was in fact Andrew Pettigrew. When I read his book, I understood what I have seen earlier when I worked in the Royal Library, where I had seen the difference, but I didn't react that a medieval book looks like that, starting with just text. And then I had all this marvelous 16th century prints from Wittenberg and the Royal Library. They look different, but I didn't react to it. But Andrew Pettigrew reacted to it.
Medeleine.
Yes, when you are speaking now, I think it jumps to our minds, all of us, what will be the next Reformation with social media. Especially as we are all doing theology on social media. We are having this kind of discussion, all of us. And, excuse me, we don't give a damn what bishops or popes or anybody say. We do this anyway. We are just out there discussing our faith. And this is a reform, or even a revolution, I would say today. But there is a caution to make, and it could be interesting to hear what you say about that.
So,
I will take up the problem. We have a journalist in Sweden called Lotta Lundberg. You may have read her columns in Svenska Dagbladet. And she has coined an expression which I think is so important. She is saying that many people, like integrist fundamentalists, are symbolic illiterates. They are just jumping on the fact, or not a fact, but just what is in your face. And then, if people are interpreting our faith and the Bible in that way, we come totally astray, of course. And that is also the risk with social media, because there is nobody to correct it, or otherwise you get killed on social media, yes. But, I mean, you don't read everything, and you cannot deepen things. So we still need the press, but the Reformation might be done on social media.
So I'm totally sure that the Reformation is already here, and that it is done on social media. And it was one of my best friends, a colleague from the Royal Library, Johannes Gutenberg, a historian, a book historian, who said this to me 15 years ago. Look, we have social media, we have computers. This is the next step of the media revolution, which started once with Gutenberg. But we are right now taking the next step, and we do not know how that will end. And you're totally right, what Lotta has pointed out, when we might look at the Brexit. I think a quite good example how fundamentalists get out and pronounce what they want to have. We can look at that what happened with Donald Trump. We may look at that what happened in the last election in Germany with the AfD, or what happened in Finland with Perussuomalaiset, and in Sweden with other radical parties. We are, I think, already there in the age of post-factual thinking. It's not longer what is in the end the fact, what is needed. It is in the end important how many likes you might have on Facebook. So here I am sometimes extremely pessimistic about what will be the outcome and how churches, societies, politicians might handle that. And we might look back to the 16th century. The outcome of the printing press wasn't always great. Okay, we get the Bible translated to many languages, and we didn't only get Lutheran or Protestant Bible translations, but even Catholic. And the Complutense edition was one of the most, and in the end, much better edition, an Erasmus edition of the New Testament. So printing press made marvelous things for the churches and even for biblical research and so on. But it was abused by those who used it for polemical writings, amongst them Martin Luther or his enemy Johannes Eck, which were working extremely well and writing those marvelous polemical texts against each other. That Martin Luther is the devil and the Antichrist, or the Pope is the Antichrist. No one was better or worse. And I'm right now working with the edition of some of those texts from Sweden from the 1530s, which are called Songs About Antichrist, typical anti-papistic propaganda from a Protestant country. This is nice, and this causes in the end religious wars. And we have those religious wars in the end of the 16th century and during the 17th century. It took us about 150 years at least, or longer, to get rid of the problems of the backside, so to say, of the media revolution Johannes Gutenberg started. And as I'm getting older and older, I'm getting more pessimistic and pessimistic. I'm not sure what the outcome will be of the media revolution, where we just might find the people who have the same idea as we have, where we do not longer get the challenge. I think that's the biggest problem and risk with social media. We might even only find our friends who are always saying what we are already believing, that this is good to be like that and like that. But we need to meet the other. I think this is even what, in the end, Jesus is talking about, meeting the other and meeting those who are different. But if we only meet those who are already amongst us or in the same club, I think then we will have quite big problems in the future. And as I said, I'm quite pessimistic.
Time is soon running out, but is it any question you would like to answer before we end this?
I would like to take up this unity in diversity.
Yes, do.
Because my dream is, I won't see this probably, but my dream is really that we have one church and that we respect one another the way we are expressing our faith. And I'm thinking of the Oriental Catholic rites, for example, which are now present in Sweden. When I was young, they weren't here, so I thought that every Catholic had the Latin rite, not necessarily in Latin, but the Western rite then. And then came all our refugees, and now I can go to all kinds of Catholic rites, and I don't understand a single word of them, and I don't recognize myself in them. Visibly, it's different sometimes. Sometimes it's very close, sometimes it's very different. But we are the same church, and we also have different canon laws. So we are treating problems in different ways. And this works. We are still one church. But why can't we, and I mean, this is my dream, locally, as the Pope says, we have to make local decisions now. Locally, why not try to widen this circle and just accept that we express ourselves differently, but we are one church. And that, I mean, I'm always saying this because I'm suffering so strongly from it. When we had Mass here 1 hour ago, I always go and ask for a blessing. Because I'm an official person from the Catholic Church, I cannot go to communion. It would be, I mean, I know it would create so many problems. But it's hurting me, and it's hurting you. And it's totally useless, because we are, in fact, believing the same thing. And we could be one. So it's just about mentality, maybe. It's not about knowledge, because we know this, but it's about power. And so power has to be transformed into real authority, where we make one another grow, really. That's what authority means. It may be a dream, but I really hope for this kind of unity in diversity, because we will never be the same anyway. And I don't think that Karlstads diocese is the same as Härnösand, for example, or wherever. I don't know. I hope I'm not saying something dangerous now, but I think we are different because we are living in different contexts. So, yeah, that's...
Just to pick on, you asked the question, is there something we would like to say or answer? I've been reflecting a little bit on Luther's attitude to other faiths, other religions, and of course he was living in a context where there were expressions of other faiths in the 16th century. And I often think with Luther, Luther is a man of extremes in many ways. When he's wrong, he is very wrong. When he's right, he's very right. And I think when you think of his faiths, you see both sides of Luther. Obviously notorious is his attitude towards the Jews and some of the terrible, terrible things he said about the Jews towards the end of his life, where in a way he allowed his own prejudice, his own fear perhaps to get the better of him. He, as you probably know, in his early days he wrote some very positive things about the Jewishness of Jesus, for example, and about how Christian scholars should work with Jewish scholars to establish the text of the Hebrew Old Testament. But later in life, I often think in the 16th century, people got ill later in life. They got grumpy, they got bad-tempered. And Luther wasn't the only one to do that. And I think it's a great benefit that we have of our healthcare today. That means that's less of a problem. Anyway, Luther did get very grumpy, and as he heard stories of Jews, stories, how true they were is another question, but Jews trying to convert Christians back to Judaism, he turned against the Jews, and he wrote these terrible, terrible things about them. And that is something we learn negatively from Luther, not to allow that fear to overcome us in our relationship with other faiths. I think one of the positive things we learn there is his approach to Islam, because of course Islam was a very strong present. There was a great fear of Islam around in the 16th century. The Turks had won the Battle of Mohacs in Hungary in 1526. They were at the gates of Vienna. There was a feeling amongst many people that maybe Europe would become Muslim. Luther himself entertains that possibility, and there were many people who were arguing that there should be a new crusade against Islam, that the Christian emperor should mount an army to fight and resist Islam. There should be a military response. And I think Luther's response to that is quite interesting, because although on the one hand he does open up the possibility that there may be a sort of defensive action against Muslims, his primary point is that the rise of Islam within Europe should not be a cause for fear or for hatred or for military response, but primarily a spur to the renewal of Christianity. For him, he responds not with Islamophobia, not with a fear of Islam, but instead saying, well, this is, well, the way he puts it, this is God's judgment upon European Christendom, and therefore European Christendom needs to go back to its own identity, to rediscover itself, to renew itself. The proper response to the rise of Islam is prayer, repentance, faith, fasting, a rediscovery of the well springs of Christian faith. And I find something quite helpful about that we're very conscious of Islam as a presence, certainly within the UK and in other parts of Europe as well. But rather than seeing that as something as a cause of fear, again, and Luther was actually quite admiring of Islam, its discipline, its order, its the fervency of those of Muslims. That he probably never met a Muslim, but from what he read of them, he admired it in many ways. And I think that combination of a certain respect for Islam, but also seeing its rise as a call to the renewal of Christian faith and Christian identity in a positive way. I think there's something quite strong about that, and actually quite unique in 16th century Europe at the time.
Thank you, Medeleine, Otfried and Graham, and I think we give them an applause. Thank you very much.